Welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast with Jonathan Rapping. In the landmark 1963 decision Gideon v. Wainwright, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled every person accused of a crime in America must be provided a lawyer, regardless of their ability to pay. This podcast is about the people that uphold that promise, public defenders. These dedicated lawyers give voice to 80% of the people thrown into the system, and yet in the national discussion regarding justice reform, public defenders are largely overlooked. This show centers public defenders in that conversation. We will explore the critical role public defenders play in addressing a wide range of issues facing marginalized communities with subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, and people impacted by the American criminal legal system. Listen as a community of advocates discuss their work to strengthen public defenders and transform public defense.
In America, immigration and incarceration are two sides of the same ill-fated coin. The term crimigration was coined by legal scholar Juliet Stumpf in 2006 to describe the intersection of criminal law and immigration law in the United States after 1980. Legislation designed to ramp up immigrant incarceration emerged during the Reagan administration. It's continued to expand under subsequent administrations. These crimigration bills led to greater overlap and collaboration between law enforcement and immigration officers, and have resulted in an expansion of the number of crimes that can lead to deportation or otherwise complicate immigration status. These discriminatory laws also increase criminalization of migration-related activity and lead to uniquely punitive regulation of the lives of migrants. The Supreme Court's even ruled that everyone is entitled to a lawyer who has the knowledge and expertise to advise them on immigration consequences, yet as public defenders are increasingly underfunded and overwhelmed, that becomes more and more challenging. And we'll talk a lot more about that during this podcast.
Well, Rap, the reason we're having this podcast, this is a continuation. This is part 2 of a podcast that we had last month, celebrating independence. Independence is the theme for this summer. Last month was Juneteenth, which celebrated the end of slavery in America and the emancipation of slaves in this country. And this month, we celebrated America's Independence Day. But we must also reckon with the questions of what it means to be an American, whether the ideals of justice and liberty for all ring true, and if there is really an American dream. That's questionable. After all, this episode, we will discuss crimigration law with experts in the field. And you know I'm a little biased because it's two fabulous women, Jessica Stern and Violeta Chapin. Professor Violeta Chapin is a member of the Gideon's Promise faculty, where she uses her abundant experience as a former trial lawyer with the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. Prior to her work in public defense, Violeta worked with the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. She has a wealth of experience working with indigent populations of all ages nationally and abroad. Violeta currently is a professor and the primary instructor of the Criminal and Immigration Defense Clinic at the University of Colorado Boulder Law School, where she and her students support and defend undocumented students and other members of the Colorado immigrant community. Her rich cultural experience of being born and living in Central America informs her commitment to justice for all people, which she imparts steadfastly onto her students. Violeta, welcome.
Can I just say, before you introduce Jessica, one other fact about Violeta: I was her training director at the DC Public Defender Service. And despite that, she has overcome that obstacle to do the great things you just described.
You know, Rap, I forgot about that. She had the honor, the experience of learning from you. And now she teaches you versus you teaching her. So I forgot about that fact. Welcome, Violeta.
Thank you, Illy. Hi, Rap. I'm so happy to be here.
And then our next guest, fabulous, Jessica Stern. began her legal career as a public defender in Atlanta, Georgia, as an alum of Gideon's Promise, and also served as a faculty member for Gideon's Promise. She is the founder and CEO and managing attorney at Stern Law, the nation's first law firm where 100% of its cases are dedicated to crimigration. Jessica and her carefully selected team focus completely on the defense of non-US citizens throughout an entire criminal case, with an emphasis on protection from deportation. She not only views success in the trials and motions she has won, but also in the dismissals and charge reductions in arguments that change a judge's view on a sentencing statute of evidentiary law. Most importantly, Jessica attributes her success to the overall satisfaction of the people she has represented. She is what we all define at Gideon's Promise, a truly client-centered lawyer. Jessica, welcome to the Gideon's Promise podcast.
I'm always thrilled to be with my GP family. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm so proud to be here with the two of you. And Jessica, I remember it was about 12 years ago that you came to Gideon's Promise as a brand new lawyer, and now you are really one of the most accomplished attorneys in the city of Atlanta and in the region. And so I'm just honored to have you here. And let me start, Jessica, by asking you a question. We often hear about how the war on drugs has fueled mass incarceration, but rarely does the conversation shift to how it contributes to mass deportation. Since 2007, over 250,000 people have been deported from the United States for convictions of drug offenses. For immigrants, even the successful completion of a drug diversion program can lead to deportation. And despite reforms in drug laws and sentencing, immigrants remain left behind and continue to face the looming threat of extreme and permanent penalties for even minor possession offenses. In October 2015, the Department of Justice released 6,000 incarcerated people from prison early in light of changes to federal sentencing guidelines for nonviolent drug offenses, yet a third of those individuals released were foreign-born and therefore deported. So I want to ask you, Jessica, how did the war on drugs, the legislation that fueled the war on drugs, impact what we see in the present state of crimigration?
That's such a great question, because we're going to see more and more of this as an issue right now, especially as, like you said, federal laws are changing, drug policies are changing all over the US, and immigration laws just have not caught up. I mean, they haven't been amended, for over 20 years. And so the war on drugs, its teeth are completely sunk into non-US citizens, because the consequences for a drug conviction are typically of the highest category. We're going to probably talk about aggravated felonies a little bit later, but a drug conviction that so many of us may see as a small thing, like misdemeanor marijuana, less than an ounce of weed. If a person has 2 convictions for that, they will be deported. There's no way to stop that. They will, they won't be able to become a resident ever in the future. It doesn't matter if they've got US citizen children, if they have a US citizen wife. I mean, it is such a severe consequence for something even as small as 2 convictions for misdemeanor weed possession.
Jessica, I want you to continue, but before you do, I want to ask, what if they live in a state like Colorado, where Violeta is, where it's actually lawful to possess that marijuana? Could they still be deported for 2 possessions of marijuana?
Absolutely. And I'm sure Violeta has some examples of how she sees that happening in her state. But here in Georgia, it's illegal here. But, in states where it's not, the federal laws have not caught up. And so the immigration laws have not been touched. They don't match at all what the intentions of policymakers and lawmakers are right now about, the impact of a drug conviction or a drug addiction. We're even seeing issues with, something that may have been dismissed. So a big consequence, that's probably one of the harshest things in our immigration law, is that, somebody who has a drug arrest, but then ultimately it's it's dismissed. For example, a client of ours right now, he was originally arrested back in 2014 for allegedly distributing hashish oil. His family owned a hookah store and they got raided and there was some hashish oil there and he was charged with a distribution type of charge. We got the charge dismissed. It was reduced down to, misdemeanor marijuana possession, and we saved him from deportation. So thankfully back in 2014, he wasn't deported. But now when he's looking to try to become a resident, he was a young kid then. Now he's married to a US citizen. He wants to become a legal resident. He's a DACA holder now. He can't, because they're going to come to the conclusion that there's a reason to believe that he was involved in drug distribution without any conviction at all. So the consequences are extremely harsh for drug-related offenses. Almost every felony drug possession charge every federal felony drug possession is considered an aggravated felony. And we'll talk later about how that, the consequences for an aggravated felony are so harsh and will continue to be punished harshly even under this current Biden administration. It's their focus right now.
Wow. And so Violeta, Jessica, Rap asked about Colorado, right? And so in your work in your state and in other places where you worked representing people, is there a particular experience or case that really, I guess, even in the past or even now, that had that aha light bulb moment about the intersection of the criminal legal system and immigration that stands out to you, that people listening need to understand what is happening? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I can. We had one particularly heartbreaking case in the clinic where I got a call from a mother who was pretty hysterical about what was happening to her son. Unfortunately, a lot of things had already happened, right? So this is sort of one of those calls where you get it and you hear this cascading sort of story of horrors that have already happened. This young man, her son was in his early 20s. He's undocumented. He had been arrested in Wyoming, which is right next door to us, for a misdemeanor possession of marijuana. He had pled guilty to that charge without an attorney, and then had been immediately sentenced to probation. He didn't have any priors, so there was very little, if any, consequence. He spent one night in jail. It was unfortunate that he wasn't represented by a lawyer, but that's another story about how some of these sort of very minor crimes can get quickly processed through the criminal system, even though they have devastating consequences for people who are not citizens. He spent the one night in jail, and during that time, the immigration system sent what's called a detainer to the jail stating, this person, we believe, is not a citizen of the United States. We'd like you to hold him for us. So they came to pick him up fairly quickly, the immigration officials, and they transferred him here to Colorado, to the detention facility in Colorado, because Wyoming does not have an immigrant detention facility. When he got to Colorado, because he had a drug conviction, he was not entitled to a bond out of immigration detention. And so his case was fast-tracked, and he was then ordered removed by the judge from the country. At this point is when mom calls me. We tried our best to intervene and stop. He was trying to request asylum. That bought us some time for a little while. But really, I think what was really painful here was that he was being held without bond for a crime that is legal in the state of Colorado. And we sent emails and calls to the Denver Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency telling them, right, very clearly about the hypocrisy of such a thing happening in the state of Colorado. And that this young man, he actually lived in Colorado. His family was from Colorado. He had just been working up in Wyoming. They would not release him. And that's an example of what Jessica talks about, which is that the immigration laws have not evolved to catch up to what's happening in the rest of the country when it comes to, for example, marijuana possession, which is completely legal now. In the state of Colorado, you can't be arrested for it unless you're underage, right? There's age requirements. But he was over the age of 21. It would have been completely legal in the state of Colorado. But that is what happened to him. And we were not able to save him from removal. unfortunately. And so he got deported for a misdemeanor marijuana offense in a state where marijuana is legal. It was outrageous.
So one of the things you mentioned, and for our listeners who have been following us for the last year or so as we've done this podcast, we talk about the importance of representation on the front end and public defenders' role in representing people and understanding the collateral consequences of a guilty plea. And when you talked about your client was in Wyoming and pled guilty without representation, for our listeners, how is that possible that he didn't have representation? Where was his public defender?
Oftentimes, and this unfortunately happens in the state of Colorado, people come in for very minimal matters that don't even really carry any jail time. Maybe it's just a fine, right, for something like that. And the court will give them the option to proceed without a lawyer, right? And often people just want to get out of there, and they're telling them, we're just going to give you a fine. You just have to plead guilty and you can leave. That's very attractive to people. What we're trying to do is encourage judges to never do that, to always assign a defender. Often what's a problem is that the public defenders don't have the funds or to staff that court, right? That intake court. And so that's an issue which we're dealing with on the public defender side here in Colorado, to make sure that there's always a public defender available at arraignment. But for years, there hasn't been. And still in courtrooms across Colorado, there are not public defenders present for arraignment. And some people plead arraignment because the DA tells them, just plead guilty and you can leave and it'll be over, right? And people want that to happen and they don't realize what the consequences are. We've also pled with judges to please, when you tell them it'll be over, please say, if you are not a citizen of the United States, there could be consequences for your immigration. Please make sure you consult with a lawyer before you do anything in the criminal case. And that's been, a lot of judges are like, I don't want to advise anybody. And us trying to tell judges, that's not providing advice, that's providing just information about the fact that immigration consequences could result.
Oh, so important. And, I want to ask you this question, Jessica, and I say this, I am not trying to pick on public defenders who I recognize
Sure.
are overwhelmed and completely under-resourced and valiantly trying to do work that would be impossible for any single person to do. But certainly it's true that just as Violeta talks about people who plead guilty without a lawyer, there are many public defenders who are advising people to plead guilty without really appreciating the immigration consequences. Again, not because they're bad people or bad lawyers, they don't have the knowledge and they haven't been given the training. And you spend so much time training public defenders all over the country about this. Could you talk a little bit about sort of the overlap between the work of public defenders and immigration law, and also how can public defenders be better prepared to stave off some of these terrible consequences like the story Violeta just described?
Absolutely. Public defenders are on the front lines with non-US citizen clients who are in jail and facing criminal charges in court. And they're the ones that are the best access to be able to help their clients. And they really have the most power and the most opportunity to interrupt the local jail to deportation pipeline than anyone else in the penal system. It's certainly not easy. So, how can they do that? The first thing I truly believe is to get to know their client and his immigration history at the first meeting, the very first sit-down meeting that a public defender has with their client. And you confirm the citizenship of every single client. If you don't do it for your client that you're assuming is a citizen, you won't know that you missed that maybe he was born in Jamaica, but has lived here for, his whole life and really doesn't have an accent from another country. Then you spend the extra time to understand certain aspects that will be necessary for you to properly advise them of the deportation risks associated with their current charge, but also any criminal record that they have already. That doesn't sound that hard though, right? But it is. I mean, in spite of the Supreme Court's ruling in Padilla versus Kentucky 11 years ago, that this is what criminal defense attorneys must do to provide constitutionally sound representation. The public defender systems and offices just do not adequately support their defenders to be effective advocates for non-US citizens. just as an example, consider the scenario where public defenders who are responsible for defending clients in serious murder cases, right? They're not experts on ballistics or DNA, but they get some decent training through the public defender systems and programs. But they also have access to funds for expert witnesses who are required to analyze the details of the case and assist in, properly defending them. And I know that we have issues with resources for public defenders across the board, but there are resources there for these types of situations, and they're necessary to make sure that they're providing effective representation and prevent wrongful convictions or incarceration. But we don't have that same recognition of the importance when it comes to immigration consequences. In the state of Georgia, for example, and this is common in most states, the topic of immigration consequences is given about an hour at an annual conference for public defenders. That's it. And not every public defender in the state is there because, not everybody's at the conference, but even those that are at the same conference, some are in another room on a different topic, because it's offered with competing topics. So, what is that saying about the value that we're placing on the lives of non-US citizens? I think it's a top-down concern, where the folks that are really in charge of the public defender systems are not fully appreciating the significance or the impact that it really ends up having once the non-US citizen leaves the criminal court system, and what's really happening once they end up in deportation. It's a resource issue, but I think to start, we have to really be tracking the need. And I know that in many states, I'm sure in Colorado, that their public defender systems, they're probably tracking how many non-US citizen clients they represent, because you have to, understand what the scope of the issue is, right? In Georgia, we still don't. I'm working on that, but there's just, a need to really understand the reality of the issue here.
So you talk about, Jessica, and of course, Violeta, please chime in. You talked about steps. One step you mentioned is at these annual conferences that the defender community has every year, whether it's virtual in this space or live, really giving more attention to what's happening to non-US citizens and doing some actual training and helping defenders represent people better. You also talked about resources that are available. I would love for you to expound on that a little bit about the resources defenders could use. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then to Violeta, what else could we do to make sure that this community is fairly represented in court?
Sure. So regarding resources, there could be the same idea of, expert resources that are available, like we have to seek whenever there's, a serious DNA issue or something like that needs to be examined. Expert resources could go towards funding the expert analysis that's needed to really properly support this for public defenders. Because even if there's all the training in the world, and I know Violeta can speak to this, and people who have been focused on PDEA-based training for a long time, it's very difficult to get every public defender up to speed on all the nuances of immigration law. And so should there be more training? Yes, but there does need to be more resources towards having assigned subject matter experts, either that you can get funding for that's outside of the public defender system, or they have somebody that's in state or in the office as a subject matter expert, so that every single lawyer doesn't have to become an expert themselves, because it is really challenging.
That is the model that we have come to here in Colorado. So Colorado has a statewide public defender system. So the main office is in Denver. And we have a lot of satellite offices across the state that are representing people in more far-flung and rural jurisdictions. The head of the public defender here, Megan Ring, is wonderful. I think if she had her druthers and she had the funding for it, she would absolutely want to hire a lawyer, if not more than a few lawyers, to be the immigration liaisons in the office, who would advise the lawyers about immigration consequences for their non-citizen clients. Lacking that funding, she has a lot of case coverage needs, right? So she needs to hire lawyers to handle cases. Really, that's her primary concern. What she then organized was a group of people who are within the public defender system who want to be immigration liaisons for their offices. and to get them trained. And myself and Hans Meyer, a lawyer here in Denver, who is a Crimigration expert, we held a bunch of trainings, and the public defender hired us to do that, to train their immigration liaisons, so that then sort of the larger groups of public defenders, when they had a non-citizen client with a very specific question, right? Because again, this legal analysis that Jessica mentioned is the hard part, right? What public defenders can certainly be trained to do is how to interview your non-citizen clients to collect the information that you need, right? They need to know some basic things about immigration statutes and how they interact with criminal law. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, it's really important to have someone who has specialized knowledge there. And that's what the immigration liaisons here in Colorado will do for their public defenders when they need a much more in-depth analysis of potential consequences. So that's a potential way to do it. What the alternate defense counsel does here in Colorado, and that's the conflict counsel who take cases away from the public defender, is that they have a lawyer, and it's actually Hans Meyer. They have a lawyer on call who they can then contract with to do a specific advisement for, right? So the individual contractor lawyers get funding from the alternate defense counsel to get an immigration advisement from the expert. So that's another way that offices have, and individual lawyers have tried to meet their Padilla obligations. And it's been relatively successful here in Colorado.
Can I say one more thing on this?
Yeah, absolutely.
I know there's always a funding issue. There always will be, and resources need to go to the case representation needs that Violeta just mentioned. But the way that I think about it is, what good is it if you save a client from, a stint in jail, if they're going to just be unwillingly deported from their kids and their spouse, and that livelihood that you and your office, was established there to fight so hard to protect, and when a non-citizen's life is getting torn apart because our systems don't yet support a few basic improvements that can really make the world of difference, there's a lot that we could do here, even with a little bit of resources.
No, that's such an important point. Really, I think it goes to the heart of this idea of client-centered representation that we talk about. Sometimes we think about lawyers as like the overarching consequence, maybe the only consequence that is important for us to fight against is incarceration or a sentence in the criminal case. And we lose sight of the fact that there are all these other things happening in people's lives that can destroy their quality of life. And we don't think about them. And certainly the immigration consequences are a huge one. And I wanted to ask you, Violeta, before I move on to another question for Jessica. You've been talking about public defenders who are fulfilling their obligation under Padilla, which is really helping to advise people in the criminal case, hopefully helping them avoid deportation proceedings. But once an immigrant ends up in immigration court and is facing deportation, there is no right to a lawyer at that stage, right? And do you have any thoughts about what we need to be doing about that?
So the immigration courts would be the first to tell you, oh no, certainly they have the right to representation if they can afford a lawyer, or if they can find a lawyer who's going to represent them for free, for example, us in the clinic. So I think it is a shameful truth about our justice system that we have an enormous immigration deportation machine that routinely deports immigrants away from their families and their homes without lawyers. As you know, I was a public defender first for many years. And the first time that I went to immigration court and sat down to wait for our one client who was coming up, but first had to see probably 13 or 14 people get ordered removed from the country without a lawyer sitting next to them, I was literally sick to my stomach. So it's a shameful situation that's happening, and it should not be happening because it's obviously an enormous consequence to be deported. And you certainly should be entitled to representation when the government is being represented by a lawyer for the Department of Homeland Security, and the judge is a lawyer, yet you, the immigrant, who may also have language issues and have to be listening to it through an interpreter, are sitting there confused and befuddled about what's happening, and you're being deported without representation. I think it could be fixed. As all of us know, we have a robust federal defender system. Federal public defenders are well funded. They have lawyers who are smart and care about their clients, And I think that where the federal government could simply implement, right, representation for immigrants in federal immigration proceedings would be through the federal public defender. It's a system that's already set up, and that should be something that should be part of their representation. The response is always, well, immigration is a civil proceeding. And because it's a civil proceeding, that's why it doesn't fall under Gideon versus Wainwright, which applies to people charged in criminal proceedings. But because of the way that some of the language in Padilla, I think is very helpful, calling deportation an integral part of the penalty, I think means that that is the kind of representation that should be provided through the federal public defender office, and our government should certainly be providing to immigrants in removal proceedings.
So for the non-legal person on this podcast, me, it sounds like you're saying, Violeta, although there is a decision with Padilla, we need a decision more like the Gideon v. Wainwright decision, which entitles people who can't afford private defense counsel to get a court-appointed attorney. We need a similar Supreme Court decision, if you will, to guarantee the same things for non-US citizens in this country. So that's another, I guess, to add to Jessica's list of what we can do and what steps need to be done. Are you saying that's another step that I don't have the experience, but I do know Stephen B. Bright, I might be pulling him out of retirement to ask him to fight that. Is that true?
Absolutely. We need a public defender for immigrants, and we need it to happen one way or the other, whether it be through a Supreme Court decision or whether we just agree and realize that that would be the just, decent, and humane thing to do.
And
if you look,
go ahead, Jessica. I'm sorry.
I'm just going to say there's no clearer data than if you look at track data that Syracuse University puts together. If you just look across the board, people that have a lawyer in deportation proceedings, people that don't have a lawyer, all other factors remaining the same, the rate of deportation for those that don't have a lawyer is at least double. It's really clear, and
Wow.
It should be enough to make a difference.
Wow. And just for our listeners, we are talking about not just people who just got to this country, we are talking about people, some of which have been here for decades.
That know no other country. They know no other home.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that, I remember I called Jessica on a matter actually right in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic, actually.
That's right.
Thank you so much for someone who had been in this country since he was 7, very similar, some case in another state, possession of whatever, he had done what he was supposed to do, paid
Veteran.
had his family, everything, living here in Georgia now. And ICE came knocking on the door at the time with people we were all sheltering in place, and they found an opportune time to come and knock on doors. And same story, his family had been here forever, and he ended up in court. And thank goodness I knew a Jessica Stern to help him.
It was a tough one. We had to go back and undo the conviction, because with these convictions, with them still, if a conviction is in place like this, it's a nail in the coffin, once the conviction happens, unless, through a miracle of some sort, you can get it undone.
Yeah. So Jessica, there is a term, testimonio, that is defined by Latin American literature scholar Joanna Barto as Latin American narrative written through the voice of the disenfranchised. And so much of what we talk about at Gideon's Promise is the importance of public defenders being storytellers, learning the voices of people who have been silenced and having the skills to really amplify them and tell those stories. I imagine that is at least as important in the crimigration realm. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the importance of storytelling and how you use it as a lawyer in representing the people you serve.
It's so important. I mean, you're definitely swimming upstream, as you know, because prosecutors and ICE lawyers, they're often going to resist hearing anything other than what they consider to be the facts that are necessary to determine whether there was a violation of law. That's all that they really want to focus on to be able to sleep at night. I get it. But I try to refocus them on the entirety of I mean, human nature, I guess, but I try to refocus them on the entirety of the person, not just this one snapshot in time. And so I usually try to consider the journey that my client took to come to the US, because there's a whole story before I meet my client. And a lifetime of stories. And, especially when we're dealing with the potential violation of immigration law, it's relevant to why they're here today in the US. So the things that I try to think about and illustrate is, whether I've considered myself in this person's shoes, and can I bring that empathy to the consideration of the judge or the government lawyer? What would it feel like to uproot myself or yourself, judge, from everything that and leave most of your family behind and maybe never see them again? And making that harrowing journey to the US in order to just simply have the opportunity for liberty. And then once you're here, work so damn hard, every day in honor of that opportunity. Have we really considered how exceptional a person truly must be to make that happen? Those are the things that I try to bring forward in conversations. Nobody's perfect. There's going to be inevitable bumps along the way, especially with a journey that's as challenging as our clients experience.
Yeah.
So Violeta, you both talked about this outdated Crimigration legislation, right? And Crimigration legislation resulted in the creation and expansion of a broad category of criminal activity called the aggravated felony. And for people like me who are not lawyers, non-citizens who are charged with an aggravated felony, it can result in deportation without a removal hearing, a mandatory unreviewable detention, and ineligibility for asylum. Can you describe to our listeners what an aggravated felony is, an example of aggravated felonies, and the punishment for them, right? And then are there changes, are these charges common in the courts? And how do you defend your clients against them?
Thank you, Illy. So I want to be really clear for folks listening here. The term aggravated felony exists only in immigration world. It does not exist in criminal land.
Really?
We have misdemeanors, right? Which by definition are like the lower level, not so serious crimes in criminal land. And then we have felonies, which are much more aggravated. And then there's degrees of felony, but the term aggravated felony, right, just doesn't exist in criminal land. So that's a term of art that public defenders have to get used to, because they're like, by nature, a felony is more aggravated than a misdemeanor. What it means in immigration court, you're right that they have expanded astronomically the list of aggravated felonies in immigration court. So there are certain things and so the scary thing for everybody to hear is that in sort of criminal state court, there are certain offenses which are neither aggravated nor felonies, which can become an aggravated felony in immigration court if a sentence of more than 365 days is imposed in the state case. Okay, so there are some aggravated felonies in immigration land that are aggravated felonies just by nature of the offense, like murder, for example. If you're convicted of murder in state court, it's going to be an aggravated felony in immigration land, regardless of the sentence. But then there are things like theft, for example, that can become an aggravated felony in immigration court if the sentence is longer than 365 days. One thing we did here in Colorado to address this, and several states have done this, is immigrant advocates together with criminal advocates and prosecutors, quite frankly, have joined together to pass legislation to make the maximum penalty for class 2 misdemeanors and municipal violations to be 364 days. And that's specifically so that it prevents any low-level misdemeanors or municipal violations from ever becoming an aggravated felony in immigration land.
Okay.
One of the things that was happening is that you had these poor public defenders who actually knew this, because we drill it into their heads. We're like, avoid the 365 days. But let's say they have a client who might have a couple priors, and the prosecutor won't give them a sentence to 364 days. Here's the public defender begging for 24 hours. They won't do it because they've got the power, and I don't think they sleep very well at night. We took that out from under, because really there's not really any deterrent benefit to a 364 days as opposed to 365 days in the municipal or misdemeanor sentencing. And we got that legislation passed to make it ensured, right, or much more sure that there wasn't going to be something that was a low-level misdemeanor in conviction in state court that magically and horrifically became an aggravated felony in immigration court. Because you're right, the consequences are terrible. We call a conviction for an aggravated felony the Death Star in immigration. Have no relief if that's what you've been convicted of.
Wow, that's incredible. That's incredible.
I just want to add one thing about this current administration, because I think that there's, an assumption that under, no more Trump, there's not going to be as much deportation. And that is true in some regards, but I just want to highlight that aggravated felonies are now the priority for deportation. So before, where they were casting such a wide net, and some people might get kind of lost because it's a wide net. Now it's a very targeted focus on those with aggravated felonies, and we're seeing people who hadn't had any issues for the longest time get knocks on their door now because they're only looking for those with aggravated felonies. So it's even more critical right now.
Yeah. So Jessica, there is, all across the country, there are local law enforcement agencies that are sort of deputized, I guess, by the federal government to help ferret out and enforce federal immigration laws. And we're hearing conversations about sanctuary cities, places where local law enforcement aren't engaging in that. But still, there are many people that think it is a good thing that local law enforcement is getting involved. And I think what's being missed is there is a real public safety concern about local law enforcement essentially pushing non-citizen members of our communities into the shadows, and where there's a distrust. I wonder if you could talk about the wisdom of authorizing or deputizing local law enforcement to engage in the immigration world this way.
It's extremely troubling, especially when you see it really heavily in communities that have large immigrant communities, whether, it's a strong contingency that's grown, or there's a lot of immigrant businesses and just groups where you tend to see more immigrant communities, these contrasts exist. Or maybe a rural county where a lot of manual laborers have moved their families to support the local economy. We've seen some of these contracts get canceled in Georgia, like with the last election. We saw that there was a real concern about this, just like you said, Rap, just that, from a public safety standpoint, being able to confidently call the police if you're a victim of a crime or you need help from law enforcement. The reason why law enforcement is supposedly there, they're not protecting everybody in the community when people are forced into the shadows, like you mentioned. So I hope that
you say they don't call police if they're a victim of a crime, but they also may be a witness, a critical witness.
Exactly.
To actually help protect the community from some more dangerous activity, and they're afraid to call the police.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, we're hopefully going to see more of these contracts be canceled with less pressure from the federal government to cooperate. And we saw more get entered into under the Trump administration. But something that is worth considering is that even without these 287G contracts, there's this perception that sheriffs have that they have to cooperate with ICE, and it's a misunderstanding of what their duties are. And it's still pervasive in most jurisdictions because what their duty really is to follow the Constitution and to not over detain people who should be released, that they're able to be released on their local charges, but then they keep holding them waiting for ICE. They have no legal obligation to do that. And they're really violating the law by holding people longer than they should. So I just hope that the culture of this changes a little bit more by, there being more importance placed on safety and just the concerns overall about being able to return back home after you've done what you needed to do with your criminal charge.
There have been some law enforcement officials that have found out the hard way that holding someone for ICE in your jail will subject you to hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. So there have been detainer litigation around this because those detainers that I mentioned earlier, they are requests from immigration enforcement to the local sheriff or jail to detain a non-citizen past the time when he or she would otherwise be released, right? To hold them so that immigration can pick them up. And sometimes they get to hold them up to 48 hours, not including weekends and holidays. Immigrants and their defenders have challenged those detainers successfully and won in court because the court found that the sheriff committed a Fourth Amendment violation by seizing the person, otherwise be eligible to be released, and that they didn't have probable cause or reasonable suspicion to do so. So there are ways to challenge it. There are law enforcement officials, we have a very progressive, he says that he is a progressive prosecutor here in Boulder. His predecessor, Stan Garnett, when Trump was elected, I found myself in this strange position of being on stage with Stan Garnett a bunch, because Stan Garnett wanted to make sure that the immigrant community knew that the Boulder County DA's office was never going to call immigration. And if we do learn it, we would never share it with immigration authorities, because we know that we have absolutely no duty to help or cooperate with federal authorities. And what we're interested in is local law enforcement, not federal immigration enforcement. So there are ways that district attorneys and law enforcement officials can make it clear to their community that they value the entire community and that their job is to do local law enforcement, not federal immigration enforcement.
So I want to ask both Jessica and Violeta this next question, and then Illy's going to wrap it up. But both of you, we proudly claim both of you at Gideon's Promise. Jessica, you were a member of the class of 2009. Violeta, you have been a faculty member and lead trainer for us for over a decade. I'm curious if Jessica, if you could talk about the ways in which your training through Gideon's Promise impacts your work as a crimigration lawyer. And Violeta, if you can talk about how your teaching at Gideon's Promise has influenced the way you teach your clinical students who are going to do this work. So Jessica, can we start with you?
It's affected all ways of my representation. I honestly can't parse out my Gideon's Promise training and say, these are the things I learned from GP and these are other aspects from somewhere else. It just really became part of me as a young new lawyer at the time, and now is interwoven into every aspect of my advocacy and representation 12 years later. And I really mean that. If I must identify something that's most impactful, I think it would be how I handle that first sit down meeting with my client. I remember going through that exercise really clearly at GP boot camp. And, there's so many barriers and walls up, especially when this client may have a language barrier or is facing the foreign court system. There's so much riding on that first conversation, where we're setting the tone and the foundation for our relationship throughout a case. And I remember coming out of that GP training with something almost like a script, but, it just had some simple yet critical components that, if not expressed to the client right then and there, that first chance you have with them, the rest of the case ends up rocky and unsettled. It's almost surgical from the professional's point of view, but yet the client really truly leaves that meeting feeling completely supported, is open to being truthful and trusting so that I can really help them. And we're in a partnership that allows me to get to know them and their circumstances so well that, I can not only maneuver confidently through the most challenging of legal issues that come up in their case, but I can bring their humanity into view for the prosecutor or the ICE lawyer. And I really believe that this starting conversation that I learned, how to navigate, through Gideon's Promise is the basis for our clients in deportation proceedings. They're 3 times more likely to avoid deportation than any others in a Georgia immigration court. And I say that just because I really believe that it comes from the foundation of how I learned to be an attorney through Gideon's Promise.
Violeta?
I'd say the number one thing that I've taken away from being a faculty member for Gideon's Promise, in terms of a specific concrete skill that I have then transferred to my clinical teaching, is related to what Jessica just talked about, and it's the bond hearing exercise, where we talk to the lawyers about the importance of humanizing your client to the judge and how important that initial meeting is between you and your client. And our lawyers have to interview each other, right, at Gideon's Promise to then make the argument to the judge. And we ask them, and we don't tell them that that's what they're going to do. They just have to talk to them about something impactful that happened in their lives. With respect to non-citizen clients, we have to start talking to them in that initial interview about their immigration status and their immigration history. And that's a scary question to get, especially if you're sitting at the jail, right, there for something else that has nothing to do with immigration consequences. So establishing a relationship quickly is important, which is what we talk to our public defenders about all the time. And then also explaining to them why you're asking them questions about immigration is crucial to that initial meeting so that they trust you, they're not frightened by the question, and then they give you the information that you need. And you may not share that immigration information right away with the judge at all, but you need to begin to collect that information. You need to have that idea in your head before you proceed with representation of that client. And all of that came from the bond hearing exercise that we do at Gideon's Promise. And I hope that it's made me a better clinician and someone who's hoping, right, and trying my best to send public defenders out into the world who best know how to represent their non-citizen clients.
So I'm going to take us back to my opening question when we talked about the theme of this episode about the American dream and independence in the United States of America. And this question is for the both of you. Is there really an American dream? I've heard a lot today. I've learned a lot today. But is there really an American dream? And if so, what does it mean to you? And if not, what disbelief has shaped you in the work that you do? Violeta, I'll start with you and then go on to Jessica.
I have to believe there's an American dream, Ellie. Certainly, I think immigrants are in this very particular space where they come here seeking a better life. They really believe that they can find a better life here. And often they are able to carve out a better life for themselves and certainly for their children, which is the number one thing that I hear from parents all the time, is that they hope that all of the struggles that they've been through, that they've continued to go through, will pay off because their children are now here, either as citizens of the United States because they were born here, or as DACA recipients because they came when they were very young. At the same time, I now talk to a lot of DACA recipients who are pretty angry, right? That their parents have had to have such a hard time in America. And now with all the back and forth with DACA, the litigation, the failure of Congress to pass meaningful legislation that would allow DACA recipients to remain here without fear, there's a lot of frustration. And I completely understand where they're coming from. They feel that despite their best efforts, right, despite their parents' best efforts and all the hard work that they've put in, that America really doesn't want them. And that's a really unfortunate position for all of us as a country to find ourselves in, because of course there are many of us, millions of us, who desperately want immigrants to both come and to stay here and to feel safe. Unfortunately, too many millions of Americans that don't want that. They want something very different. And I am hopeful, I have to be hopeful about the way that this country is going, but it's definitely been a struggle over the last couple of years for me to retain that hope. That being said, I'm always happy to work with immigrants, to help immigrants, and to talk about the goodness of immigrants every time I get the opportunity to do so. And maybe that's what some of us who aren't lawyers can do. That's sort of the best thing that we can do. We can do it as lawyers, we can do it as non-lawyers, is to talk about that and to recognize the benefits that immigrants bring to this country, and that all of us who are immigrants should also recognize as well.
So Jessica, to you, same question. Is there really an American dream, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I've been disheartened so many times, by a courtroom or like an immigration agency outcome that completely strips away the possibility of having legal status in this country, or worse, rips a person away from their actual closest family members and sends them back home over one mistake that they may have made that ultimately led to a criminal conviction. It's interesting that Violeta brought up DACA, because that's what I was thinking about as well. When you think about this American dream, I think my view of it has been tested the most when I think back to, a young adolescent, maybe a DACA recipient whose parents have sacrificed so much to bring them to the US when they were a child, but then faces mandatory deportation for a crime that, a US citizen would just get a slap on the wrist for. Something that could, so understandably happen to any young person who's trying to find their way in the world, especially in a world that doesn't always feel so welcoming, as Violeta mentioned. And then this kid is deported back to a country that they barely know. And then what usually happens is their parent, who worked so hard to get them here, has to stay behind here in the US to continue building the life that they planned for their other children, because they can never really see each other again, because the undocumented parent can't leave the US to go see their kid, and the kid can't come back here because they've been deported. I mean, this pain that you see in a parent of a DACA child who's deported is really the most heart-wrenching that I've seen. And that's when you see the doubt of that American dream creep into their parents, otherwise undying love for the US. But with all that being said, I really do believe that the American dream is alive and well, and it's a powerful force. I talk to so many clients and like foreign nationals about this around the world, because I often doubt it myself, especially over the last few years. It's hard to not doubt it. But almost every single person I talk to, every non-citizen, reassures me that it's all absolutely worth it. All of the blood, sweat, and tears, all the uncertainty, all of the discrimination, because in so many countries, there is no hope. There's no hope. There's no pathway towards a sustainable living. And America represents that hope and possibility still today.
Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts on that. And I'm going to leave with this last question is, for everyone now who is fired up like myself to do more to defend immigrant rights, where should they start, or where could they start? Could we find more information about what's happening right now in the criminal courts and in the immigration courts? Violeta?
Well, I have a book recommendation that I was going to share. There's a book called Undocumented Americans by Carla Villavicencio, which is excellent. She used to be a DACA recipient. She has now gained status through another way. Her parents are still undocumented. And she's a brilliant writer, and she conveys more than anything, I think, is outraged when you read what she writes about the struggles that her parents have gone through. So specifically that book, I think, just to learn about how immigrants in America feel right now about the American dream. In terms of what people can do to learn more, I mean, there's certainly, there are practice advisories online about criminal and immigration related legal matters. I think if people are not lawyers and not going to be representing people and just want to get some more information about the ways that they can be allies, I think, to immigrants, I think there are a lot of immigrant advocacy organizations that are constantly seeking volunteers for people to come and help. And we've got an organization that just goes and visits immigrants at the detention facility and meets with people who don't have visitors, right? That's a beautiful way for people to get involved and to become knowledgeable by talking with other people that are engaged. And I'd say finally, from my perspective, I would be, if you're a US citizen and you can vote, then you need to be aware of where candidates stand when it comes to immigration related issues.
For sure. Even just in having conversations, right? Because there's a lot that legal advocates can do, but on a regular basis, we can ask ourselves, how do I or the other people around me address the conversation? Are we perpetuating stereotypes? Are we making assumptions instead of asking questions to expand our understanding? Have I considered myself in this person's shoes? Really what it took to make that exceptional journey and sacrifice to be here in the US and leave everything behind. Really, have we considered how exceptional a person must truly be to make that happen? Because I want more of that exceptionalism in my country. There's a real chance just from a conversational standpoint, but of course, legislation is what's going to make a difference here. And it's got to be a motivation for lawmakers and not to be such a controversial issue. But, there's current legislation right now. We can urge the Senate to pass the American Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. The House passed the act in March, and it brought us a step closer to providing that pathway to citizenship for several million people, including Dreamers, TPS, and farm workers. So we've got to actually make our laws different too.
So Ilya is about to wrap up. Before she does, I just want to thank you both, because I think I tend to be a pretty hopeful person. And I think it's really because I'm fortunate to be surrounded by folks like you every day who, not only sort of believe that one day we can achieve an American dream, but literally spend your days every day inching towards it. So thank you both so much for just taking the time to be with us. And Ilya, I'm going to as always, give you the final word.
So Professor Violeta Chapin from the University of Colorado Boulder Law School and Attorney Jessica Stern from Stern Law here in Atlanta, Georgia. I want to thank you so much for joining Gideon's Promise, the podcast. And I want our listeners to remember that no one is free until we are all free. This is Ilham Askia.
This is Jonathan Rapping.
Wrapping it up.
Hey, Il, before we hit that outro, why don't you tell people how to order a copy of the book in your radio voice?
In my radio voice?
Yeah, in your radio voice.
Okay. Get your copy of Gideon's Promise, a public defender movement to transform criminal justice at Amazon, IndieBound, Beacon Press, or wherever books are sold. Pre-order today, and a portion of proceeds will help us support public defenders.
Oh, that was good. That was good.
Thank you for listening to Gideon's Promise, the podcast, with Jonathan Rapping. For more information on the topics covered and featured guests, please visit our website at gideonspromise.org. And finally, please subscribe, share, and let us know what you think.